voluntary self-reporting? Because I know in my day job, I look at the breakdown of demographics across boards and commissions appointments, and that's voluntary data that the government collects. And my second question is, how can we work with the new emerging black bank in Minnesota that just kind of came online last month? If we could put some of the investments or CDs in there, or could we have an open house where institutions like them can come in and learn more? Thanks.
Yes, Council Member Lee and Chair. Yes, it is voluntary reported, so we do use our information that we collect from our NeoGov system as well as for the Affirmative Action Plan reporting. And so, yes, that is voluntary in how people identify themselves individually. And then for your second question, we have reached out to First Independence Bank, and we are developing a relationship with them and inviting them into the program as well.
Oh, thank you.
Yep, so we have direct contact out to I don't want to get the title wrong, I believe it's Senior Vice President Emma Jenkins.
Oh, thank you.
Any other comments?
Yep.
Edward?
Just to follow up on his one, communities have done this socially responsible banking initiatives. They've done, and I'm not suggesting you have to do this, but what they've done is issued a request for depositories. And in those proposals, they asked them, if they are in compliance with Federal Community Investment Act, provide them with homeowners disclosure information, which is required through the Comptroller of Currency and the Federal Reserve, which is the compliance entity around equal opportunity in banking, and particularly in low-income communities, is why those laws came online. And in that request, they also asked if they were to secure certificates of deposits from the entity, what kind of programs would they offer in a usable form to low-income and communities of color, versus a lot of the products and services that they provide right now really are not in a usable form for the community, but you can drive that. And it could be things that we're trying to do, like the Section 8 homeownership program or the affordable homeownership program. So anyway, St. Paul has a social responsible lending program. I'm not sure where it is now, but it was very effective. I think 20-some banks participated in it. They were funding emerging minority contractors, small contractors. Some even proposed starting branch banks in low-income communities where there were none, to give people geographic access to those that institution. Sunrise Bank kind of got its big growth from securing those kind of deposits, and is doing some pretty interesting things right now. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out there. I have a lot of questions about this. I really love the thrust of it, and I think it's great, and I don't want to be too long-winded about it. But when I look at these, I can't help but to reflect on the fact that the laws that prevented anti-racism and to rid systemic racism have been on the books since the 60s. And so we are now in 2022 saying we're going to push this out here without really looking at the administrative application of the policies that have been on the books since the 60s that is perpetuating the anti-racist culture that exists and the socioeconomic disparities that have resulted from it. Because in theory, if the institution was in compliance with those laws, you wouldn't have that. So it's kind of hard. I mean, I see this, on one hand, you don't want to argue against the thrust of it because it's very important, but it's almost like if you didn't do that quantification of how the people who are in charge with administering the provisions in those laws are applying them or not, you really don't have any baseline to really move forward, so you're sort of spinning your wheels. And it's three essential ones that this thing speaks to. Equal opportunity in contracting, which is 1968 Johnson administration Executive Order 11246, and all the subsequent amendments by all the administrations, including Biden recently, around doing equity analysis. He said, you're gonna have to do equity analysis, which were audits, which is what we propose, that you do an audit of the administrative application of those laws. Affirmative action, which came on the books in '64 with the Civil Rights Act. I know up until 2013, not all agencies even had an affirmative action plan in the state, because one of the responsibilities of the Council for Minnesotans of African Heritage was to look into that, and we reported that out. And they have since caught up, but even an audit after that was done under the Data administration with outside independent auditors found that those plans were not in compliance with the affirmative action program for the state of Minnesota. And then here we talked about affirmative action, and it seemed like the first plan that was written, it was a backtracking to write the plan for 2018, and then kind of caught up in 2022. So there was a lot of things going on. And like our request said, that this is not an I got you thing, but if you really want to get serious about ridding systemic racism, getting a handle on anti-racism, solving socioeconomic disparities, creating prosperity and wealth amongst all of the communities, you have to first analyze how an entity like the Met Council that deals with huge amount of resources that funnel through it and set all the frameworks for how communities are going to use those, how they are faring with the administrative application of those laws. And it should be outside independent auditor who comes in, do that. If there's staff that's charged with those things, the worst that can happen is that they've made some mistakes with applying provisions. Now they've learned because of the audit what they're missing, and now they can pick up and start to administrate them. But it would drive a plan like this a lot better. So, I like the thrust of this. I think it's great, but I think the piece that's really missing in terms of just baseline information is looking at how the administrative application of equal opportunity contracting, those are the procurement laws, affirmative action, which is the hiring internally, and then there's an enforcement side where you have to enforce the subcontracting entities and the local communities that are granted funds to utilize them. You have to enforce their compliance with those as well. And a lot of times when people hear that, they get nervous because when you say audit, it's like, oh my God, we don't want to touch an audit because an audit is going to make us look bad. Quite frankly, under federal law, you are to examine yourself anyway. And you have a directive from the President of the United States with all of the new money coming in, particularly transportation funds that are coming into the state, and other resources, rescue funds, all of those things that handle new dollars that may come through Build Back Better and all of that. He's saying, get your baseline on this. I really want to see how are you meeting the intent of affirmative action and equal opportunity, so that when you get these funds, you're able to make sure that all communities are included in it. And that's what that executive order said. And there are people like the NACP, the Urban League, that have been big stewards around it, and other organizations that have collaborated them, who was pushing the administration to issue that executive order so that entities like the Met Councils and others that receive those federal dollars are examining the administrative application of those laws. I know there was a lot, but otherwise, you know, I don't know. You're just going to be spinning your wheels. I love the thrust of this, but I think we need that audit.
Can I just augment what Edward just said in the notion that we can use the federal laws when the going gets tough, you know? And often attorneys are the ones who tell us we can't do things. And the very things where the intent of those federal laws came from are the same, the attorneys are telling us we can't do the same things. And so I think it's really important to be able to use those laws, and I know maybe I don't understand them, I'll just be honest, but to understand those laws and use them when the going gets tough on this stuff. Because I wasn't around in the 60s, but I've heard that a lot lately, like this, all of this was the same discussion we had in the 60s and then again in the 80s, you know, and so how do we break the cycle of just talking about it and then not, where's accountability? And that's Met Council, but it's societal too, and it's all of our independent organizations. Like when there's we can't do this because of this, how are those federal laws and the intent of those federal laws used to augment what we're trying to do instead of, oh, this case over here said we couldn't do this. You know, and so I've been thinking a lot about that and about, I mean, you bring that up like every meeting, Edward, which is great. But, you know, I've been thinking a lot about if these federal laws are really on the books, where are the attorneys to support what we're trying to do instead of try to say we can't do it. So that's just kind of a general comment. I just want to put a point on that, Edward. In terms of the definition of anti-racist, we talked about that a little bit with the Metro Transit equity work. And I was really appreciative of the staff person because she incorporated the comments. Was that you? Okay. On Zoom, everyone just looks so different. I'm sorry. What's your name again?
Selena.
Selena, thank you. I'm like talking about her. I'm pretty sure that's her. So the same comments, I guess, I would have again, which is to center the experience of the people of color in the definition, and to acknowledge the harm that past practice has done in the definition, and then to be very explicit that we seek to undo and reverse this harm that's been created. And so there are pieces of that in there, but just this notion that we acknowledge that our previous work was racist. We don't have to say it like that, but we can say our past practice has done harm to these groups of people, and we seek to undo that harm and that's what anti-racist is, or a variation of that. So I said it when we talked about it at the Metro Transit, so I wanted to just say it again here.
Again, and maybe you hear me talk about this until I'm no longer representing District F on this, but just a mere fact, to justify targeting it to the people that have harm, you have to establish the legally defensible way of doing that, right? And the legally defensive way of doing that is found in the audit of the administrative application of those laws. If you show one provision was not being administered under affirmative action program for the Met Council, that means you're not in compliance. And who's harmed by that? The folks that affirmative action was intended to help, which is, you know, protected group members, and those are defined by, you know, people of color, and, you know, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, persons with disabilities, and women. And so that gives you that legal justification to say we have to make up for the harm that was there. So we can now give some preference to them. And then the other thing, without doing that, and where the preference stand out in here, it's legally challengeable. Because I would ask the question if I was one of the contracting communities that will benefit from what you explained there, where you said that the goal is to get to 30% utilization. I would have to ask the question, if I was white, what justify preference being given to them? But there's enough data in here to show that there's been underutilization for the last 30 years by the Met Council through the disparity studies and the methodologies that meet the strict scrutiny of the courts. So those are there, Mason-Tillman, MGT America, and Team Research Group. Those basically would establish that to some extent. But you would also then have to look inside and say, why was there underutilization identified in those disparity reports? And that speaks to who was administering equal opportunity in contracting. And you have to go back and look at, were they applying all the provisions that led to that underutilization? We know in the disparity studies it says there's more than enough willing, able, and available contractors across all those communities to meet their minimum benchmark. And then when you say you establish things like a percentage, 30%, that's not required until you've had that disparity studied and done that kind of audit. Or it can be challenged by folks who have been the benefactors of underutilization. So when I look at that, and then if I was there, is that a hard 30? Is that the cap for the community? Why not 40? You know, why 30%? Why do communities of colors have to be stopped at 30%? Because any benchmark set is just a minimum utilization amount. That's written like, once we get to 30%, that's it for all the colored people. I don't get no more. But if there's capacity to go beyond that and they can compete, why not? I mean, so there's just, like I said, generally I like the thrust of it, but I think that, you know, people that know probably won't say anything about this, that are in systems like this, and because they have a visceral hate towards this diversity that exists, inside they could be hoping for a challenge. They were hoping that once it got started, somebody would challenge it, and somebody would come in and say, how do you justify that preference? And all we're saying is, if you're gonna go this way, let's not do something that is not legally defensible, and that you don't allow for people who have nestled themselves inside of these systems, which gets at the whole question of systemic racism, and then I'll back into anti-racism versus systemic racism. The new Jim Crow is the folks who move inside the system. They get authority to make decisions about hiring and contracting opportunities. And they are protected by civil service rules and unions, and they make sure that the administrative rules give them an escape to not hire that person or entity that is equally qualified as anyone else. And they'll use the waiver that exists within the Minnesota system, where they fill out this one little sheet and it says, you know, as much as I want to hire this qualified protected group member, I felt more comfortable with the white person in the interview. So will you waive it this time and we'll consider it the next time? And that has been a horrible practice in state government operations and its subunits by appointing authorities. And I speak and say this because the auditors who did the audit during the Dayton administration of 2017, Fondengala and Hall, was invited over to retrieve the one-page waivers from the Department of Administration Management and Budget Office. And the lawyer that went said he literally cried because there were stacks of boxes for a 3-year period of time that were filled with those waivers coming from the appointing authorities saying, we won't hire a protected group member and we're gonna defer to white women because we felt more comfortable with them in the interview. And they said it was just, uncovering that was like all of these qualified people who went through the process of trying to get the jobs and were qualified were just simply pushed to the side because they had that avenue to waive.
Edward, I'm just gonna stop because I wanna make sure that we have time for everybody.
Well, this is an important discussion, and I'll shut up, but it's an important discussion.
Just
I
wanna
really
make
don't
sure that
appreciate
all folks
being.
have time to. Anita, you have a question, comment?
I can appreciate the two comments that we had here, but I have to tell you, personally, I'm frustrated. I'm beyond frustrated, I'm angry. I have been doing civil rights and human rights for 50 years, since I was a young woman. I did it for myself, I did it for my kids, now I do it for my grandkids. And with the plan that goes, and I'm sorry I get emotional because sometimes I just get so angry because it seems so easy to me. We have laws, we have the ability, just do it. I look at the 2030 and I think, my gosh, I'm gonna be 76. I can have great grandchildren by that time, and I will still be out here if I can be. But I shouldn't have to be. He talked about the federal laws. I was around in the 60s. I remember what it was like. It's no different. I've sat on city, county, and state boards, and everybody has a plan. And we're still sitting here 50 years of my life later, talking about future plans, when we have laws to put into place now. We have the power and the ability to put it into place now. We shouldn't have to wait another 18 years. We should be looking at implementing all of this tomorrow, yesterday, last month, last year. If we know it's the right thing to do in our hearts, why is it so hard to do it? Who are we afraid of hurting? People are already hurting. I'm tired of pussyfooting around and worrying about hurting people's feelings when there are so many other people who are hurt and have been hurt for generations. And I'm talking about my own generational family when I talk about my children and my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren. I shouldn't have to be talking about something that's put into effect that will maybe help them, when the laws and the language and the policies are already here to help them now, today. I appreciate the work in that's done as this presentation, I really do. I know it takes time and I know it takes effort. And I know it takes the buy-in from a lot of people. But I'm tired of worrying about the buy-in. I'm tired of it. I really am. Racism is here, alive and well. We know it. So let's deal with it. We know it's gonna be there in 18 years if we wait till 2030. Because it's the right thing to do, because it's a future plan, because it's out there. I've looked at 2010 plans, I've looked at 2000 plans, I've looked at 1995 plans. Like I said, I'm sorry if I'm being really emotional and angry. No, I'm not. I'm not sorry. I take that back. I am. I have a right to be. This has affected not just me, but my children and my grandchildren. And it affected my parents and my grandparents. And my parents, I remember when I was a kid going to meetings with my mom, and the school board would put all these plans out and they had the same language. When are we going to stop and say we've got to do this tomorrow because it is the right thing to do? Because we're tired and we've had enough. Let's start looking at implementing tomorrow instead of 2030. I understand that counties and cities and states love that future planning, but that's all it is. It's just words now to me. It's just the future planning that just kind of gets put on the shelf and nobody looks at it in 5 years and nobody even looks at it in a year. And things go back to business as usual. And we're still talking about implementing, and we're still talking about language, and we're still talking about what's the right thing to do. We all know that. We're all smart people here at this room. We're all smart enough to know what is the right thing to do. We're all smart enough to know that there are federal laws that are been implemented when I was a kid. To use them, to use the language and say because it's there, and we should follow it. Not because, oh, well, let's look at it and let's start doing it slowly. I'm tired of moving slowly. I'm tired. And who knows if I'll be around another 18 years. I don't know. Only God knows. But I know, and I hope that I will have great-grandchildren who will be affected by this. And I want to do for them now, while I can, while I'm alive, while I'm healthy. You all love your families as much as I do. I know you do. And we all want what's best for our families, and we all want what's best for our futures, right? And some of us who have grandchildren in this room want them to have more than we had. That's always been the way. And those of us who are of color in this room want our grandchildren to have a better life than we have. We want our great-grandchildren to have even better lives. We want our great-grandchildren to not have to be a number or a percentage. I want my great-grandchildren to be equitable, to be a human right on the planet, to live in this world, because that's what they are right now. They live in this world, whether anybody likes it or not. And I know they have rights. And I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure that those rights are there for them before they're born and after I'm gone. So let's do what we need to do. Like I said, I appreciate the 2030. I understand how that goes. I really do. I've worked in that kind of government situation for 36 years. I sat in committees like that too and planned out. But when it comes to race and racism, it's an old story. And it's not going to change until we change it. And what we can do now, instead of planning for the future, let's plan for now. Thank you. I appreciate being able to just get it out of me because it was just ready to erupt.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anita.
Mr. Chair,
Just 1 second, just want to make sure everybody get a chance. Do you want to say something, Sai?
Oh, I can just respond quickly. So, Chair and committee members, thank you, each of you, for your comments today and certainly for the depth and the feeling. And certainly no need to apologize for any of the comments and the thoughts that are expressed here. And so this is work we're doing now. And so that's the question before us today is how do you as well as EAC members want to participate in the work that we're currently doing right now to make movement? We're not waiting until 2030. That's where we're going to have some end measures. It's about what we're doing right now. So out of, for example, one of the things you spoke to was the certificates of deposits and the purpose and the way that that's being handled in other areas. That's the intent of the council in putting this money with certain community banks and credit unions. And we're going to continue that. We've already done the investment of 18 million, going up to 25 million, and then reviewing that again by the end of the year and looking at additional banks. And then that's the next step is how are they reporting back to us on how they're utilizing those funds, how it's impacting the community, how it's not just put in the mix of their other general funds that they're receiving. So that's just one example. There are certainly many others, and we'll be coming back to you talking about that. It's not a plan to come back in 8 years. It's a plan to come back as often as you want us to talk about where we're at, what we're doing. We've certainly got a number of numbers about how we're already making changes in our small business spend and how that has increased and changed over time. We certainly have reporting. We do quite a bit of reporting on a monthly and yearly basis. We just finished a triennial review for the federal FTA to come in and review 23 different areas of compliance across the council to do their triennial audit of us. And so that is happening. We have a commitment for one of our strategies around those procurement funds that you mentioned, to get to our direct spend, and it is a minimum. As you stated, it is not a maximum. It's not, we only want to get to a certain amount. That's a goal that we set, knowing that we're currently very low in our spend. And so 30% is a huge number for the council, but that's not a floor. That's not, if we can reach 30%, we believe we can go higher. So that's the work that we have to do. You are invited at any time to participate in it, to reach out. We are running past time. We do have 2 other presentations today, but continue to connect with me, send me any information offline that you want to send it through Lila or Nyambi if that works best for you, because you get messages for them all the time. One more thing around the Metro Transit work and that discussion that you did. We have an equity policy as a council. Lila's going to go through that and what we're doing for updates. The work that Selena brought before us was the definition specific to Metro Transit, and that was around equity. And so this is your chance to participate in what's the council definition around anti-racism.
Leah?
So I have one comment and 2 questions. The comment around the definition is that I think to be truly anti-racist, you can't just call out the disadvantages that have accrued to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. You also need to call out the advantages that have accrued to white people. And the policy should specifically say that as a way of signaling that business as usual, where people were preferencing some candidates over others, is not going to continue anymore. And then my questions or things I'm curious about is, do the investment dollars, the intention around that to that point of unearned advantages, do those plans also include divesting from institutions that have caused harm in Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian communities? So one question is divestment. And then my last question is, I really loved the kind of concept around shared power and co-creation at the very beginning, and I'm curious how that is specifically showing up. Where is the shared power happening? What is already being done to share power and co-create?
Chair, I thank you for those comments, and I was going back to write down the first one, but it was the comment about acknowledging the benefits that have already been received by others, and so that's an area that we can look closer at our definition and add that language in. And then the comment about divestments, and so certainly open to more detail and more depth in that. So any ideas that you have for what that would look like, what that should mean for the council as a whole?
I think local governments have divested from Wells Fargo and US Bank. Probably others have more knowledge about that, but you could look at what local governments have done and consider if those would be appropriate investments for the Met Council as well.
Thank you. And with regard to your comment around shared power, and so that is the work that we're currently doing with our trust as we're reaching out, not just as organizations coming to the table, but going back into the communities that we serve, as well as with our own employees that will be not only doing this work, but often impacted by the work that's being done as well. And then getting the voice and the input and what actions the EAC wants to either see from us or be a part of and engage in with us. So you have continued invitation for that kind of action and work.
You have an
And then
EAC
taking it back to your
council, don't be
communities as
afraid to
well.
use us.
Yeah, and taking it back to your communities, and so your role is one, you come here as professionals, but you also represent certain districts. Many of you are at large, but you often are talking to people within various districts, cities, work profession, and so what are you hearing from them? How are you taking this information back to them? And what do they want you to tell us? And where do they want us to come next?
Madam Chair, can I just make a suggestion? The dashboard that you presented, the beta dashboard, I feel like that would be a nice thing to have quarterly or just, even on our agenda, we could click on it and check it. Cause that had all the information about hiring, I think it was hiring data and procurement data by race. And it was in beta when you came and presented it. Was that just last month? It feels like it was 6 months ago. But I think that is a great communication tool for, are we actually improving our numbers on a quarterly basis? And so that would be one suggestion, is that we could either have that on an agenda or just like a link to it. And people could look at it and say, is Met Council hiring more people of color? Are they procuring with more businesses of color? And so anyway, that's just one tool to communicate that info.
Just gonna move on because we have other items of the agenda. If you have any comments or questions, why don't you send those to Lila, and then Lila can compile them and then forward it to Sai or whomever on Sai's team will be receiving those for an answer.
Mr. Chair.
Just 1 second. And then I just wanna ask a question. It's, we got the definition of anti-racism, but I was wondering why we didn't have a definition of racism. Or do we have one? I mean, because we need to know what we are anti about, right? So what's the thing that we're fighting?
The anti is being proactive against racism versus saying that we want to prevent or we want to prohibit. Being proactive is the anti-version of it, yes.
But do we have a definition of what racism is? As part of all of it?
That's part of our discussion today.
Okay, all right. Just to clarify, why we started with the anti, it seems like we define the problem and then we see what we can do about it, right? So, anyway, thank you. Yeah.
We started with, Mr. Chair, thank you, systemic racism. And the first goal of this whole thing is systemic racism, but then it evolved to something called anti-racism. So I just wanted to point that out. And then I would be remiss if I didn't say this in this room amongst everybody here, and I'll submit it in writing so it can be distributed. Without that audit, you're setting yourself up for a potential challenge to something you're doing. And once that challenge happens, the folks that are inside the system will say, oh my God, the Center for the Experiment, or whatever they're called, challenged us, we've got to stop. And it happens all the time. Way back in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, somebody went out in the program but didn't have that baseline information to justify it. Somebody made noise or threatened to sue, and then it just got stopped. And that's all I'm saying is, if we can get that done, your program will be excellent. It'll be justified and it can be implemented easily without it being interrupted once it starts to make progress.
Well, thank you, Edward. And just for the record, of course, we have raised that issue many times already. So it's a conversation that has happened, hopefully will continue to happen. But anyways, so let's move on to the next item, the next presentation. And I think this is Lila that is going to be presenting to us the Equity Implementation Units and Investigations and Resolution Unit update. It's Lila and Kimberly, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. As I mentioned, we are currently going through department updates, and that includes the equity policy. That's the one that I'm responsible for at this time. And so I sent out, or Nyambi sent out actually a copy of our current equity policy, and then also a draft, a very early draft that includes feedback from our initial stakeholder engagement. Again, it's a very early draft. I'm bringing this I went to the management committee last week, and then today I'm coming to the EAC to gather additional feedback. So the background of, next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so a little bit of a background on the equity policy. Our first equity policy was created in 2018, and it hasn't been updated since. The only update it's gone through was actually a template update, and that was in 2020. Of course, the world has changed quite a bit in the last few years. Minnesota has changed quite a bit in the last few years, so it's absolutely due for an update, and it also this is the timing of this update is connected to AREJ, and also we're going through planning for the regional planning for 2050. What does the equity policy do? Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so it recognizes systemic discrimination and it commits the organization to continuously breaking down barriers. We want to use language in the policy that creates this, that recognizes this. We also create a structure for institutionalizing equity. We disrupt unjust practices, policies, and procedures and holds us accountable. It commits the organization to the use of an equity lens in all the decisions that we make at all of the different levels within the organization. It also creates clear expectations. Our stakeholders are really everyone, right? When I presented last week to the executives in the organization, they asked me if this is a policy that is an internal policy, so an operational policy, or whether it's going to be a regional policy. And it should be both. We should be aligning our equity work internally with what we're doing externally, right? If we're asking staff to be equitable, anti-racist, and to go about hiring or planning or small business contracts, we want to make sure that they're using this structure that we're creating through the equity policy to do that work, which then translates to regional policy equity. This is our timeline. Next slide, please. Oh, next slide after that, sorry. I apologize, I'm going through the slides on my laptop, so. All right, so this is where we are as far as a timeline goes. We did our OEEO initial equity policy review. It went through my team, it went through SCI, it went through folks in OEEO. We received feedback, and then I sent it out to internal stakeholders, so people around the organization in all 5 divisions. A draft was created, and that's the draft that everyone received in the mail. I'll send another copy. I'll also have Greg pull that up at the end after the if we have time, after Kimberly's presentation. Last week, we went to the executive team for review and feedback, and today we're here at the EAC. Once I receive additional feedback from the EAC, from additional internal stakeholders, the executive team said that they would also like to contribute to the updates. We'll create a second draft, and then we'll send it to general counsel. We're hoping that we can have a final copy that can be updated in August. Next slide, please. All right, so the 2 copies that you all received, I ask that you please review them if you haven't already. I have a few things I'd like for everyone to take a look at. Initially, what's missing, what works well, and what needs to be changed. And this is the original copy or the draft. The next ask that I have of you all is we all belong to organizations. If you belong to an organization that has an equity policy example or is doing equity work in a certain way and you would like to share that with us, please share that with me. Please send that directly to me. And then one other place that I would like folks to take a look at is we don't have a description of the policy in the equity policy at this time. What we have is we have kind of a very brief verbiage on that the policy is, we have the authority to set an equity policy and then very specific tasks, operational tasks, that are listed in that area. So we want to create a section where it actually describes the policy itself. And then we can maybe move those operational tasks into maybe a process or a procedure on how to implement the equity policy. Does anyone have any initial questions?
So you want organizations versus municipalities versus counties
Yeah,
or all the above to submit equity plans to you?
all of the above. Yeah, we would like to do all of the above. I've done some initial research on what's out there, and that's helped me shape some of the language, but I'd love to see additional examples. If you know of an organization that does equity really well, and they have a great equity policy, and they have it outlined well, I'd love to see it, I'd love to take a look at it. We can use it as a reference or as an example, we can borrow maybe ideas and put that into our equity policy if it works.
So this is not necessarily being driven by the municipalities that intersect with the Met Council at all?
This is not, this is our equity policy for the organization.
And you said that someone asked, would this be a regional policy? And you said, yes, it would be a regional policy.
So this is our internal policy, right? So if, for example, I'm on the task force currently working on the regional policy, right? If I am well versed in our equity policy, we have an equity task force, which right now we're creating a strategy and a framework, and that is gonna be used as a guide for regional planning, right? And equity policy is one of the components that goes into that. Then that translates into regional policy making decisions, right? But we wanna make sure that we get our policy in order, we get the language correct, and that it's an accountability piece, right? So we have something that we can refer people to, and we wanna make sure that our language aligns with what's happening with the regional policy planning. And that's something that Lisa Barajas actually expressed as well last week, so.
The last question
Yeah,
is,
please.
if this is gonna be region-wide, is there will there be an enforcement mechanism or consequences for non-compliance?
So I just wanna clarify, this is not region-wide, so we're setting an equity policy for us to follow inside the organization. This is not something that we're setting for municipalities to follow. Each municipality or each entity, each organization, they have their own set of policies and regulations that they have to
Okay.
follow, yep.
So it's not required regionally?
No,
Okay.
regional in the sense that we're creating a regional planning guide, right? That we're creating the 2050 plan at this time. And so we wanna make sure that all of the components that create equity are in order, and one of those things is the equity policy.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'll send out a copy of both again. If we have time maybe after the discussion, I'll have Greg pull it up on the screen if that's okay. Alright.
Hearing no other questions, I can start. So, Greg, if you could pull up the IRU policy procedure update slide. So continuing along this same line, as I said at the beginning, my name is Kimberly Malone and I'm the manager of the Investigation Resolution Unit in the Office of Equity and Equal Opportunity. The policy and procedure that I am currently working on has to do with our discrimination, harassment, policy and procedure. So similar to this conversation we were having a little bit ago, what are we doing now? We have laws in place now. Is this correct?
Yeah. Go ahead, sorry.
Should I keep going or do you want me to? I said it was two separate.
For the IRB.
I'm gonna start because there's not much on the, it was visual for the sake of having visual, just more what I am here to tell you about. So we're here to update the policy and procedure related to the discrimination work that we're doing. So and this is work that is currently in place and certainly kind of in the realm of continuous process improvement. What can we do to make this better currently? So the policy was last updated in 2017, and the procedure was last updated in 2008. So I joined the council last June, and we were taking a look at these policy and procedures and see that there are definitely changes that can be made now that would make our policies stronger and make our procedure more understandable to a broader audience, and to give more transparency about what discrimination complaints and harassment complaints actually mean. So we've been in contact with our regional administrator, who you met last month. Mary Bogie was here, and she's in agreement with us improving these processes right now. High-level updates. So I'm going to talk both about the harassment policy and then about the procedure that attaches to it. So we've renamed the policy the Discrimination and Harassment Prevention Policy, and the previous version of this document went over inappropriate behavior, which we feel is I'm trying to watch what he's doing at the same time that I'm talking, and I should stop looking at the screen. The previous version of this policy talked about inappropriate behavior. So it's discrimination, harassment, and inappropriate behavior. And we removed inappropriate behavior because it made it really confusing. Human Resources has a separate policy that talks about respectful workplace and anti-bullying, and that's really where inappropriate behavior falls. So we wanted to remove inappropriate behavior from the discrimination. Yay! Discrimination and harassment policy. That's correct. And I'm now oh, look at that. Ta-da! Okay, here's the background information that I just went through with you, and here's where we are now. So I was saying, we removed inappropriate behavior, and that meant that we needed to do a name change right off the bat because we had inappropriate behavior in our name, so we removed that. And you may be thinking, well, what's really in a name change? The title of your policy doesn't really mean much. We also didn't talk about it being a prevention policy. It was a discrimination policy. And we don't want a policy to teach discrimination, right? We want a policy that prevents discrimination. The former version of this had a few things defined, but it left out a lot of definitions. And so we've drafted a policy that defines every protected class under state and federal law. This is a little tricky because some of these things are defined in state and or federal law. Some of the state and federal definitions are different from one another. The state law is generally broader than the federal law, and so we've deferred to state definitions where we can find them. But not everything is defined under state law, under statute. So there are definitions, and then where there are definitions that do not appear in statute, we did some research to determine what do we think is most appropriate to define these various protected classes. There's no one right or wrong answer. There's a lot of things that people have to say when you start defining race, color, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, right? You can go down the list and you can find definitions that people may or may not like, or you may have a bunch of people who feel passionately about why one definition is right and why the same definition is wrong. So the definitions are really a section that I think are particularly important to draw attention to. I'll also stop here and say that I talked to Lila this afternoon about the best way to share this with you. So similarly, I want to pull these up on the screen to share momentarily, and then I'll have Lila send these out to you so that you can have them in front of you and you can look at that. And while I can certainly take comments today, I really would love for you to dig into what these say and to provide written feedback to me so that we can take that into account as we continue through this process. Some other major changes to this policy is the addition of accountability. So we didn't have it wasn't clearly defined before about who was responsible for what at each level of the organization. And we wanted to make sure that we were outlining, what is an employee's responsibility, what is management's responsibility, what are council members' responsibilities, what's the responsibility of the Office of Equity and Equal Opportunity. Finally, we've added a whole bunch of statutory resources. So federal and state laws have been mentioned several times this evening, and we've added links to those laws so people can go see what does the law say on this matter. It's important to note that our policy is not meant to replicate the law. If we could only create a policy that said the same thing as what the law says, then we can't take any actions as a council until we have behaviors that we believe are violating the law, and that's not good. So we want to be able to create policies so we can take action when we believe that there's behavior that's happening that may not rise to a legal violation, but that certainly is something we don't want to see happening in our workplaces. Next slide. Oh, next slide, please. This is the high-level updates for the procedure. The former version of the procedure was fairly short and contained some basics of if you see something, say something, right? So report discrimination when you see it. It didn't have a whole lot of detail about what's the right way to do this, how do you go about this, how do you find out information, and it really didn't have a lot of information about what happens once you have reported. And so what I'm striving to do here, and I'll share on the next slide kind of the feedback that I'm already getting. So this draft is in progress and is kind of constantly evolving day by day right now. What I'm striving to do is to create a procedure that when you look at it, it's completely transparent what to expect. When should you get a response that we've received your complaint? What happens after we receive it? How do you know if we investigated it or not? What determines whether or not we investigate something or not? What happens at the end of an investigation? I hear a lot of times, particularly from witnesses, someone who says, I was interviewed as a witness so-and-so so many months ago, and I've never heard anything. Well, a witness to a case really shouldn't typically hear any news about what happened in that investigation. That isn't part of our process. And right now, the fact that former witnesses are like, well, I never hear anything. How do I know if this was ever even finished? We want to make it clear in the procedure what they can expect. They should know they're likely not going to hear anything again. And in contrast, the complainant who brings the complaint and the respondent who the complaint is against, they should know when they can expect an update and what their update will entail, right? So as you read through this, I want you to kind of put yourself in the various different positions of if you were the person bringing this, if this was against you, if you were someone who got called up and said, I think that you might have seen or heard something, I want to talk to you. Is it clear what you can expect? That is my intention. And I'm already receiving feedback to add more, to add. And I was thinking it was getting a little lengthy already, but there's certainly some spots where I know that we can continue to add information. Let's see, again, we added more on the roles and responsibilities within the procedure, so you'll see that in here. And then minor changes, again, the title changed, the name of our office has changed, adding, scope of investigations, those statutory resources. A lot of this is duplicative from what was in the policy. So take a look at those things as well. So these are, I'm almost done with my slides and then I'll take questions. These are the internal stakeholders that we've already begun to engage. So as I said, my unit falls under the Office of Equity and Equal Opportunity. That's that green circle at the top. So this has been shared both with our director, Cy Jordan, and with all of the other leadership within OEEO to provide their feedback. Our Human Resources and Labor Relations Department, our Office of General Counsel, and then I've reached out to folks from Metro Transit, Environmental Services, Risk and Audit, Community Development, Metropolitan Transportation Services, and our executive team. And currently there are folks from all of these areas that have either already provided their feedback or are currently reviewing it to provide additional feedback. So as I said, this is kind of a work in progress. Right now, like day by day, almost hour by hour, I get some feedback and I'm like, oh, that's a really good idea. I want to make sure that I can get, these changes made even as the next round of edits are coming in. So this has been a really collaborative process. And so this is where we are kind of in our review. So we started with OEEO and then our general counsel. And like I said, that was that big stakeholder. The entire last slide is all those people we reached out to. Last week I did present to the Met Council executive team. That's all of the directors across the Met Council. And then today I'm here with you at the EAC. So what I'm hoping to do is to receive kind of all of those edits and to make our next draft. And then it goes to our policy and procedure review team. And they'll have some time with this. Eventually, then we go to the management committee for prep, and then a management committee meeting, a full council meeting. And again, I hope to publish in August, similar to Lila's timeframe. And then that means that by fall, we'll be freed up to do training, to be able to communicate these changes out to folks, and to be able to really provide the information about, you know, what has changed, what does this all entail. So as I said, you'll receive these via email, I assume? Via email to take a look at, and you can provide, I'll give my contact information so you are able to contact me directly. Certainly you can also provide comments to Lila or Nambi, and they can get them to me. So what questions do you have? What feedback do you have? If you see things that are missing, number 4 doesn't quite apply in this audience, I apologize. And do we have support from you all as in how we're proceeding with this? So I can take questions now.
Okay, maybe I missed it. One of the biggest fears is retaliation. And people who fear reporting and then suddenly after 20 years of employment start having bad work reviews or having problems on their job. That is retaliation.
Of course.
And so I think, are you explaining that, what retaliation can look like to both parties? Because a lot of times supervisors and management or the boss gets mad and retaliates in little ways that are just continual, and they need to know that that's illegal, and the employee needs to know that that's illegal, and that they have rights.
Absolutely. The retaliation definitions appear in both the policy and again in the procedure, as well as examples of what retaliation can look like. Obviously, it's not an exhaustive list, but to give examples. And then retaliation reminders are given at the beginning of every interview, whether it's to a complainant so that they know what retaliation can look like, to witnesses and to subjects.
Okay.
So they're all informed that retaliation is not only illegal, but it's also against policy, and that any incidents that could be retaliatory should be reported to us.
I'm just gonna chime in because I love this area. That's what I do. I'm just gonna send you like 68 to 70 pages of comments. But just one particular issue that I wanted to raise is that when you're developing the procedure and you're examining the complaint and looking at all the evidence, one problem that we run into my job at MPS, Minneapolis Public Schools, doing that same work is we use the definition that the behavior has to be severe and pervasive before we can say it's a violation of our own internal policies. So it's not only that the behavior happened, it's not only that the behavior is bad, but it has to be bad enough to constitute a violation of our own internal policies. And just quickly, we have a case in which we had a senior administrator that her pet peeve was through case, so I investigated this. She would go up to females of African descent, and out of the blue just touch their hair and say, "Oh, I love your puffy kinky hair," something like that. But because she only did that once, we couldn't find that it was a policy violation because it wasn't severe and pervasive. So what we decided to do is treat even single incidents of very specific behaviors as a policy violation per se, without having to look into what other effects the behavior had on the person. So just a suggestion that if you can identify certain behaviors that merit like one strike you're out, write that out and identify them specifically. So otherwise folks are gonna challenge, well, I just said this joke once and now you're firing me? That's not severe enough. They might have a case. But if you change if your policies reflect specific incidents, that's more, it's more defensible. So yeah, that was my comment on the policy, and I'll send that later, my other suggestions. I just have one more, and this is for Lila on the equity policy. And the policy addresses all the to change policies, procedures, systems that produce inequities, right? But this is a discussion that I always had. No system in the world has ever produced an inequality. It's a person that produces an inequality. And we're not calling that out. We're saying we're going to change your systems. No, what you have to change is the person. Change the way they behave. And the way to do it is proactively through education, but unfortunately in my experience, with consequences. I think that has to be part of the policy to say, the systems might be broken, but the folks that are implementing the system are the ones that are producing the inequalities. It's not the abstract system. And those folks have to be held accountable for their actions. So I don't know how to incorporate that in policy. That's a discussion that we had in my own job at Minneapolis Public Schools. But I would love to have that somehow incorporated into our policies. And somebody else had a comment or a question?
I do,
Edward, yes. thank you.
always.
Yeah.
Just a couple things. The state sanctioned definitions for protected class is in Minnesota Statute 363A. And Minnesota's sanctioned definition for protected group is under Minnesota Statute 43A. So, and I don't know if you can add other classes or groups unless it's authorized by legislature to do that. I think you know that, right? So you're adding those things. Right now in the Met Council's Affirmative Action Plan, it has all of this procedure. Are you altering that? Have you taken a look at what's in your existing plan that gets at harassment, discrimination, and workplace conduct? Policies and procedures?
Yes, council chair and committee members. What's in the affirmative action plan is a duplicate of the published policy and procedure, and so these policies and procedures will overwrite what is in the affirmative action plan ultimately. So these are updates to those policies. So as I'm talking about what's in the affirmative action policy, the procedure that it outlines, this would replace that.
So these could technically go beyond the administrative rules associated with, that are authored by the state, I think is 9,500, administrative rules 9,500 or 5,900. So these can exceed that. I think in certain situations, subunits can be more liberal in certain ways, but then there are some things that can't go beyond what the state law is and the state administrative rules are.
We have the potential to create whatever policy that we want to create as far as this is concerned, that does not have to be in alignment with the law. Certainly we can't contradict the law, but we can take what the law is and we can make it more liberal, more favorable. And that's what this intends to do. And that's what mirrors what the state of Minnesota does. So if you look at the state of Minnesota's affirmative action plans and you look at what MMB, Department of Admin, and all of the other state agencies are doing, they also take this same approach of going beyond what the law requires to create policies to be able to have policy violations far before you would have a legal violation.
And just to follow up to that, currently in your affirmative action plan, there is a way that you identify protected groups, and that you name 2 of them, but the others are put in an aggregate and called something like minorities or people of color. And under 43A, it says you should identify protected groups in your availability analysis and utilization report by each of the protected groups, which then would be your reports should report if you have underutilization in the workforce. It should not be reported as people of color. It should be reported as Black. You know, what that underutilization is by each of the protected groups. So But also in the report, it says, we do it and code it this way because that's what MMB has recommended that we do. So if your policy is going to be more liberal than what MMB is recommending, will there be two different things? Over here, we're doing this because we feel this is a better way, and over here, we're doing this because MMB feel is a better way.
Mr. Chair and council members and committee members. Let me take a step back from there and state that the affirmative action plan lays out obviously our affirmative action plan protected and those protected groups which it defines. As part of the affirmative action plan, we do need to have our discrimination, harassment policy and procedure as part of the plan. They're referenced in the plan. It's in the plan. It's actually the language is cut and paste into it. That does not mean that all of the protected bases that we say that you cannot discriminate on the basis of are going to be included in our affirmative action goals for hiring, which right now are based on minorities, women, and people with disabilities. So we're not saying that, so there are those protected groups for our affirmative action plan, and then within the affirmative action plan, they outline the complaint processes, and it's much broader there of what the protected bases are. So we go beyond minorities, women and people with disabilities, and we add all of the protected bases under state and federal law, being age, color, creed, disability, familial status, gender, genetic information, membership in a local human rights commission, marital status, national origin, race, status with regard to public assistance, religion, sex, and sexual orientation. So there are many more protected bases than what we do analysis on in terms of our affirmative action plan, but those are still listed in terms of being discrimination and harassment prevention. Is that clearer?
No.
No.
But you're talking investigatory and who can bring a complaint under human rights statute with all of those protected groups you last mentioned. Under the employment piece and setting goals and those kind of things, there is no protected group called minorities. Protected groups are women, persons with disabilities, Black, African American, Asian Pacific Islanders, Indigenous, and Latino, Latinx. Those are the protected groups. Under employment and hiring, in your affirmative action plan, recruitment goals and establishing the procedures there. Someone being discriminated against is a whole nother group called protected classes that can't be discriminated against. And they include those protected groups, under 43A.
Council, Mr. Chair and council members and committee members, yes, I understand that. And this policy and procedure is about people who can file complaints for investigative purposes for discrimination, harassment. And it is not editing the content of our affirmative action goals, but it does edit our affirmative action plan because our complaint policy and procedure are part of our affirmative action plan. But it is not changing our affirmative action planning. It will update what the complaint policy and procedure is for all those protected classes. But it does not get to the goal planning.
And it will be more expansive than what's there now, is what you're saying. The discrimination and harassment portion of the affirmative action plan could be more expansive.
I'm saying that I don't think that we're changing what, it already is expensive. The currently published policies do not match the legal definition. It's already more expensive than what the law requires. It already allows people to bring complaints and for discipline to be established or initiated before something rises to the level of a legal violation. But this policy and procedure are still being updated to try and make it more transparent about what the process is, how you go about using the process, what to expect during the process. I do believe that we are expanding on the policy and procedure that are currently published, but we're not, I don't know.
If I might just jump in briefly, I think that we're talking about apples and not oranges.
We're just talking about the affirmative action.
No, it's, what I'm saying is that what the policy against harassment and discrimination is one thing that is really not related to the hiring practices that are set up on the affirmative action plan. They are different animals and they have different rules. Yes, the harassment policies are included on the affirmative action plan, but those don't need to shape, one doesn't need to shape the other, right? So I just don't want to confuse the two different systems because they're not addressing the same thing. So we're running out of time. I just want to make one last comment is about the protected classes. Yes, we can go way beyond what the state recognizes. One thing that I would suggest is that you be as creative as possible, especially if you had anecdotal information about specific situations that had happened but that were not covered by policy. Quick example, we had a complaint of discrimination based on weight. Somebody said, well, somebody called me, fat or obese, I forgot the word. That's not a disability, or we could not interpret that as a disability. Obviously, it's not related to race, ethnicity. So it was a bad behavior, but it couldn't fit into our definitions for a violation of our anti-harassment policy. But we are thinking of including that and some other, things that are not, at first glance, you might not think are protected classes. But my point is to be as creative as policy because you do have the authority to include anything and everything that is coming up, that is becoming an issue, and that you need to single out as a protected class that folks that engage in those behaviors will be held accountable. So that will be just my encouragement to be as creative as possible. Okay. Do we have any more presentations?
No, but we need to move on to committee
Yes,
business.
thank you. So moving on, Leah, sorry for
Okay, so we have
taking
5
over the sound.
We have 5 minutes. I do want to respect people's time. So what I'm going to do is give a quick overview of where we are and direct us to one decision that I hope we can make quickly and another decision that might need a follow-up by email or in some other process. So we are currently and have been for a year revising our bylaws. There has been some back and forth about the right procedure. And so some of the things that have happened is we had a request for a subcommittee to look at the bylaws. We solicited interest in that subcommittee and didn't have interest. Then we brought the conversation into the full committee, got some input, used that input to make some suggested revisions. Those suggested revisions went to council, which then sent them all back saying that they were unworkable. Pretty much everyone that we suggested came back from council as unworkable. So now we're a little bit at a standstill and would love to have some committee members help us figure out a pathway out of that standstill. So that is a request and we can take that up again, probably by email. One part of our bylaws is coming into play right now, and that is our bylaw language around subcommittees, which say that our subcommittees must function as our full EAC committee does. And our full EAC committee meetings are public meetings, which has been interpreted by council as in-person meetings. That is not the interpretation that I would use. I think they're two different words, but that is how it's being interpreted right now. And Francisco offered a really elegant fix that I would like to offer up to the group, which is we transform our subcommittees into working groups. And so that they are no longer subcommittees and they can meet virtually and not in person. So can I have a motion to change our subcommittees into working groups?
Madam Chair, I move we change our subcommittees into working groups.
Second.
All right, let's do a vote. I think we have to do a roll call vote. Is that how it works?
We do have to do a roll call, but I do want to bring attention to any time a quorum meets, it's required to be public. So if the working groups, I don't know if we can change, do you know?
Quorum is 10 people.
It would be based upon the same interpretation and memo that was presented to the council members and under review and applies to them as well. So I don't have that in front of me.
So could we change subcommittees to work groups? If we call them work groups instead of subcommittees, does that change anything, do you know?
I wouldn't have that answer right now.
Okay.
Do we have work groups in our bylaws?
We don't have a definition for
They're
work
not
groups.
referenced at all in our bylaws.
And that's the loophole.
Mhm.
So, yes, we can have work groups because we don't have a prohibition against work groups. And because it's not a full committee meeting, then no, we don't need to be, announced or anything like that, so. And there will never be more than, there won't be quorum because the subcommittees will be less than the quorum that they can.
Currently quorum is
So
10
there
people.
will never, that will never be an issue, so.
All right, so I had a motion and a second. So we will do a roll call vote.
I think we just need to go A and
Aye.
A's.
A and A's. Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion passes. All right, we will follow up about bylaws overall, probably by email.
Madam Chair, I
Yeah.
just want to make a comment, it's one thing to use counsel, and I think we should all the time, around critical questions, but we should frame those questions and make sure that they're written out so that right now, I'm sort of feeling like we're creating this adversarial relationship against legal counsel, because I don't think the questions that are being presented are done in a manner that allows them to help us find a pathway. And,
Not just here,
yeah,
in all spaces.
but I don't want the perception that legal advice isn't important or somehow they're the enemy or whatever. And I'm beginning to feel that way with some of the responses we've gotten back. And I believe it's because the question is one that, if framed better, can help give us that advocacy kind of role that they play in saying, okay, if you want to do this, then these are the things you will need to do versus no. And then we go back and go, why, and so anyway.
I couldn't agree more. I would love to get to a place where we are discussing intention and finding pathways with that intention. So I'm hoping a couple of committee members will help us on that path. So, agreed.
Sure. But just a point of information, do we have a quorum now to vote on the minutes at all?
We do, and we can do that.
Good.
Thanks for pointing that out.
I move we approve the minutes from May 17th.
Thank you. Can I say a second?
I second.
All right, can we just do all in favor?
Yep.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right,
Do we need to approve the agenda?
I think we already did the
Okay.
agenda. I think we can let that go.
All right.
So thank you all for the wonderful discussions this evening. We've just celebrated Juneteenth and this is Pride Month, and to me, both of those speak to liberation. And so I wish you all to experience liberation in your own lives and welcome others into a liberated space.
Thank you.
Thank you. We don't usually, we just close.
I know. I'm sure you're so.
Oh, it's good.